Security crushed his invitation and called it a fake. A man in a worn suit, dismissed as nobody thrown out, while tuxedos laughed behind him. Then the doors above him burst open. The CEO herself came running, stopped the entire gala cold, and screamed his name in front of hundreds. What she said next made every laughing face in that room go silent. The man they had just humiliated was the stranger who once pulled her from a burning car and disappeared before she ever learned his name. Nobody in that ballroom would ever look at him the same way again. Everett lived alone in a small house on the south side of Belmont, Colorado. A house that was old, but spotless, filled with hand tools, technical drawings, and half a dozen machines he had rescued from scrap heaps and brought back to life with nothing but patience and steady hands. He had once been a respected safety engineer, a man companies trusted to walk into dangerous factories and tell them the truth even when the truth cost money. That reputation ended the day a corporate cover-up needed someone to blame, and Everett, quiet and unwilling to fight dirty, became the easiest target in the room. He was never convicted of anything, but no courtroom could undo what the newspapers did to his name. Every major firm in the state closed its doors to him within a single year. And he learned to stop knocking. These days he made his living fixing furnaces and generators for people who could not afford a real service call, charging fair prices, and often walking away with less than he was owed, because he could not bring himself to squeeze money out of someone struggling the way he once had. He kept his hands busy and his opinions to himself, and he had grown used to being invisible in rooms full of important people. Then one gray afternoon, a heavy black envelope arrived at his door, embossed with the golden crest of Whitaker Aeronautics. Inside was a formal invitation to the company's 50th anniversary gala, an event for executives, investors, and people whose names appeared in magazines, not people who fixed their boilers. There was no signature, only a single handwritten line at the bottom of the card. It read, "Some debts cannot be repaid with money." Everett almost threw it away. He had no interest in stepping back into the world of boardrooms and quarterly earnings, the same world that had once decided his career was worth sacrificing to protect someone else's mistake. But in the corner of the card, pressed faintly into the paper, was a small emblem of a mountain split by a bolt of lightning, the same symbol used by the Regional Mountain Rescue Unit that had responded to a car fire on Black Ridge Road 4 winters earlier. Everett remembered that night with a clarity that never faded. Snow had been falling sideways in the headlights when he came around the bend and saw the flames. He remembered pulling a woman free from the wreck, wrapping her in his own coat against the cold, and walking away before the rescue trucks arrived because he never wanted thanks, only to know she was breathing. He never learned her name. He decided almost against his own judgment to attend the gala for one reason alone: to find out who had sent that card and why they remembered a debt he had already forgotten he was owed. He sat with the card for nearly an hour before making his decision, turning it over again and again under the kitchen light, studying the handwriting for anything familiar. It was not a corporate hand, too uneven, too personal, the kind of script belonging to someone who had written the words quickly and meant every one of them. Everett had spent years learning to distrust anything that arrived wrapped in gold trim and expensive paper, but something about that single sentence refused to let him toss the invitation into the drawer with the rest of his unopened mail. Before he left his house that evening, Everett pulled out the same gray suit he had worn to his daughter's graduation. Years earlier, the only formal clothing he still owned. He sat at his kitchen table and stitched the frayed cuff back together with thread meant for canvas, not fine wool, and it showed. He looked once at a photograph on the shelf of his daughter, now grown and living overseas, building a life far from Belmont, and reminded himself he was only going to find an answer, not to be seen or celebrated by anyone. Then he climbed into his aging pickup truck and drove toward the lights of downtown, where a line of gleaming limousines already stretched around the block. When Everett stepped down from his truck onto the curb outside the Grand Belmont, the shift in the air was immediate. Every head under the golden awning turned toward the dented pickup, and then toward the man walking away from it in a suit that had clearly seen better decades. Whispers followed him up the steps before he had even reached the door, and the sound of quiet laughter began before anyone knew a single thing about him. He kept his shoulders square and his eyes forward, the way he had learned to do years ago when the world decided his story before he ever got to tell it. He parked his truck between 2 black sedans, aware of how out of place the dented tailgate looked against the polished chrome surrounding it, and walked toward the entrance without hurrying, refusing to let the stairs quicken his pace. He had faced worse rooms than this one rooms, where his career and his name had been picked apart in front of strangers, and he told himself quietly that a lobby full of unfamiliar faces could not do anything more to him than what had already been done. The line at the entrance moved slowly, filled with senators, developers, and men whose watches cost more than Everett's truck. He held his invitation with both hands, waiting his turn, while the young woman at the check-in table scanned name after name with practiced efficiency. When his turn came, she typed his name into the system, twice frowned, and told him there was no record of him on the guest list at all. Everett offered to have her check the raised seal, the signature at the bottom, and the printed identification number embedded in the cardstock. All details of forgery would struggle to replicate. That was when Odessa Pike arrived, the head of public relations for Whitaker Aeronautics, moving through the crowd like she owned the marble beneath her heels. She looked Everett over from his scuffed shoes to his uneven collar, and decided in less time than it took to blink that his card had either been stolen or printed by some opportunist hoping to slip inside. She did not ask to examine the seal Everett had just offered. Her only concern was the photograph some blogger might take of a man who did not belong standing beside people who very much did. It was at that moment that Barrett Sloan strolled past the company's executive vice president, recognizing Everett instantly, but choosing to feign ignorance for the benefit of everyone watching. With a smirk aimed at the small crowd gathering near the entrance, Barrett asked aloud whether the hotel had started letting repairmen attend events meant for actual leadership. Everett recognized him too, the same man whose name had once appeared buried but unmistakable in the internal report that ended his career at a manufacturing plant years before. He said nothing yet. He was not there to fight a war in a hotel lobby. Odessa instructed the head of security, a former police officer named Silas Trent, to remove Everett from the red carpet before any photographs could be taken. Several guests had already begun filming the spectacle, certain this would make for an amusing story to tell over cocktails later. Silas examined the invitation carefully and quietly told Odessa it appeared authentic and deserved verification before anyone acted, but Odessa was already walking away, her decision made. Everett did not resist. He asked her only one question before she disappeared into the crowd, whether she was turning him away because his name was missing from a list, or because his clothes did not match the people already inside. Odessa never answered him directly. As Silas returned the crumpled invitation to Everett's hand, he noticed something that made him pause: a long scar running across the man's left palm, and a scratched steel watch on his wrist. Two details that matched almost exactly a description Marlo Whitaker herself had once quietly circulated to the entire security division. Silas said nothing to Everett in that moment, but as the disgraced engineer turned and walked back down the steps toward his truck, the security chief pulled out his phone, took a discreet photograph, and sent it directly to Marlo with a short message telling her that the man she had been searching for might be the one just walked out the Willius door. Inside the ballroom, Marlo was reviewing note cards for the speech. She was about to give a speech Barrett had spent weeks pressuring her to use as the moment to formally announce a merger with a materials supplier he controlled through several layers of shell partnerships. She barely had time to glance at her phone before the image loaded, but the second she saw the scar and the watch, every carefully rehearsed sentence in her mind disappeared. The memory of the fire came rushing back the way it always did, sudden and complete: the smell of smoke, the sound of the door tearing open, and a calm voice telling her she was going to be fine. Marlo abandoned her prepared remarks, entirely walked to the edge of the stage, and told the orchestra to stop playing mid-song. She turned to Odessa standing near the wings and asked exactly where the man in the photograph had gone. Odessa tried to explain that security had simply removed a suspicious individual who had no legitimate place at the event, but Marlo was already moving, cutting through startled guests and gliding past open champagne trays toward the front entrance, without a single glance back at the stunned faces she left behind. Everett had nearly reached the parking area when he heard his name called out behind him, sharp and certain, cutting through the noise of idling limousines. He turned, but he did not recognize the woman running toward him in a formal blue gown, her hair falling loose from its pins. The last time he had seen her face, it had been streaked with blood and ash, barely visible through smoke and snowfall. Nothing like the composed executive who now stood before him, gasping for breath. Marlowe's eyes went straight to the scar across his palm, and her voice nearly broke as she asked him directly whether he had been the one who pulled a woman from a burning car on Black Ridge Road 4 years earlier. Everett answered simply that anyone standing there that night would have done the same thing. Marlowe told him that was not true, that most people would never have risked getting close to a vehicle that could explode at any moment, let alone reach inside it twice. She reached out and took his hand right there on the curb in front of valets and stunned onlookers, and led him back up the steps and through the golden doors he had just been thrown out of. On the stage in front of everyone who had laughed at him minutes earlier, Marlowe announced that the man standing beside her was the reason she was alive at all, a man who had never asked for a single dollar, who never even gave his name, and who had disappeared into the night before she could properly thank him. She pointed toward the entrance where the humiliation had just taken place, and told the entire ballroom that the most important person in that room had just been judged and discarded because of the suit he was wearing. Odessa stood frozen near the edge of the stage, her face draining of color. Guests who had recorded Everett minutes earlier quietly slipped their phones back into their pockets. Silas felt a flood of relief that he had trusted his instincts and sent that photograph. Barrett, meanwhile, felt something closer to dread, aware that Everett might recognize him and reopen a chapter of the past he had spent years burying. Laurel Gaines, the chairwoman of the board, watched the entire scene unfold from a table near the front, her attention shifting sharply toward Barrett, whose composure had cracked for just a moment longer than it should have. Marlowe guided Everett to sit beside her at the head table, and it was there, glancing down at a folder resting near her seat, that Everett caught sight of a company logo he recognized immediately. The same materials supplier responsible for the substandard components that had once triggered the very accident that destroyed his career. Marlowe apologized to Everett in front of the entire room, then turned directly to Odessa and asked her to confirm publicly that his invitation had in fact been valid all along. Odessa offered a reluctant apology, blaming a system error for the confusion, and Everett did not press her further or try to shame her. He said only that a broken system could always be fixed, but prejudice only changed when the person carrying it chose to change. Marlowe admitted she had been searching for him for 4 long years, hiring investigators, offering rewards, and combing through every rescue report from that winter, all without success, because he had left no name behind. Everett explained that he had disappeared that night because he was rushing to reach a hospital where a family member needed him, and that he had never considered pulling her from that car, an act of heroism, only something any decent person would have done. When Marlowe offered him a substantial sum of money as a reward, Everett declined. When she offered to buy him a new home, he declined that too. Instead, he asked for something else entirely: permission to review the technical documents behind the merger the company was preparing to finalize. Marlowe was caught off guard by the request, but before she could respond, Barrett interrupted, insisting that a repairman had no business anywhere near confidential corporate records. Everett pointed calmly toward the logo on the folder and told the room that the alloy produced by that same supplier, a company called Sloan Meridian, had once caused a structural collapse at a facility known as North Valley. Barrett, without missing a beat, announced to everyone present that Everett was in fact the disgraced engineer who had been removed from his position after that very accident, and that his word could not be trusted by anyone in the room. In an instant, the past Everett had spent years trying to leave behind was dragged into the light in front of hundreds of strangers. Marlowe refused to take either man's word without proof, and demanded that both of them bring forward whatever evidence they had. Everett explained calmly that the collapse had never been a design flaw at all, that someone had quietly altered the material specifications after the original safety plans had already received final approval, and that the signature authorizing that change belonged to Barrett Sloan himself. Barrett denied it instantly, claiming the signature had been forged, but the accusation had already landed, and Marlowe postponed the signing of the merger on the spot, a decision that sent Barrett storming off to send an urgent message to an associate instructing them to retrieve the North Valley files before Everett could get anywhere near them. The following morning, Marlowe brought Everett to her private office to hear the entire story from the beginning. He told her that 8 years earlier, he had led the safety review team at North Valley and had personally flagged a shipment of substandard alloy, formally halting construction until it could be replaced. Within a single day, that order had been mysteriously reversed, and the digital records were altered to make it appear as though Everett himself had approved the very material he had rejected. Weeks later, during an overnight maintenance shift, the structure gave way entirely. No families or children were present, only adult workers doing their jobs, but lives were still lost and others permanently changed. When Everett tried to warn company leadership what he suspected, Barrett, then head of procurement, produced falsified data suggesting that Everett had unilaterally modified the original design without authorization. The timing could not have been worse. Everett's wife had just passed away after a long illness, leaving him the sole parent to a daughter stepping into adulthood, and he had neither the money nor the strength left to fight a prolonged legal battle against a corporation with unlimited resources. He agreed to resign quietly, in exchange for the company dropping any threat of a lawsuit against him, sacrificing his entire professional reputation to protect the roof over his daughter's head and her chance at an education. Marlowe realized, listening to every word, that Everett had never been a coward. He had simply been forced into an impossible choice between his own name and his responsibility as a father, and he had chosen the second without hesitation. Marlowe then revealed something of her own, that the crash on Black Ridge Road had not been a simple accident either. She had received a folder of internal whistleblower documents just days before the crash, documents that made powerful people inside her own company deeply uncomfortable, and her car's brakes had failed on that mountain road almost immediately afterward. Everett understood at once that the fire that nearly killed her might never have been random at all. Marlowe asked him quietly whether he had ever considered fighting to clear his name once his daughter had grown and left home once the immediate danger to his family had passed. Everett admitted that he had thought about it more times than he could count, drafting letters he never sent, and rehearsing arguments he never made in front of anyone who could act on them. But by then, the story had already hardened into fact in the minds of everyone who mattered, and he had grown weary of shouting into a silence that never answered back. He told her that after a while a man learns to measure his worth by the people who still trust him, rather than the people who never will. The weight of what her family's company had done settled heavily on Marlowe, the understanding that the very corporation she now led had helped destroy the life of the man who once saved hers. Everett did not blame her personally. He told her that power itself did not make a person guilty. Only the choices someone made with that power determined that. Marlowe promised him she would reopen the North Valley file completely, even knowing it could send company stock plummeting and threaten the position she had worked her entire career to earn. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from Silas, informing them that the old North Valley Records warehouse had caught fire overnight and that every document connecting Barrett to the falsified reports was now at risk of burning to ash before anyone could examine it. Everett, Marlowe, and Silas arrived at the smoldering warehouse just as firefighters finished containing the blaze, though most of the paper archives and server equipment inside had already been reduced to blackened debris. Barrett appeared soon after, offering a performance of concern, while quietly suggesting that the fire had conveniently erased any evidence worth investigating in the first place. Everett walked the perimeter, slowly studying the scorch patterns, and noticed that the flames had originated in the backup electrical system, where the wiring had clearly been rerouted on purpose rather than failing naturally. Tucked behind a collapsed shelf, he found an old thermal monitoring unit, the kind of device long considered obsolete, but one that still retained an independent memory chip recording temperature readings, and every time the warehouse doors had been opened. Barrett insisted the unit was long broken and useless, but Everett pried it apart on the spot using spare wiring from his own truck to rig a temporary reader capable of pulling the stored data. The readout showed that a high-level security badge had unlocked the warehouse doors exactly 2 hours before the fire began, and that badge belonged to Barrett's own office. Barrett claimed the badge must have been stolen, but Silas quickly pulled traffic camera footage from the surrounding streets, revealing a vehicle registered to a consulting firm with direct ties to Barrett parked less than a block away the same night. While sifting through the wreckage, Everett uncovered a heat-resistant steel box buried beneath a section of collapsed flooring. Inside were mechanical duplicates of the original material certification slips records, showing the alloy had been swapped for a cheaper version immediately after Everett refused to approve it years earlier. What the box lacked, however, was Barrett's direct signature, leaving him room to claim, as he always had, that a subordinate acted alone. Barrett tried once more to steer the conversation, suggesting that even if the badge records were accurate, someone could have cloned his credentials without his knowledge. a claim Silas dismissed almost immediately after confirming the badge, had been physically swiped at a reader with no history of tampering. Marlowe watched Barrett carefully as he spoke, noting how quickly his explanations shifted from one theory to another, each one slightly more elaborate than the last, the unmistakable pattern of a man improvising rather than recalling the truth. Marlowe insisted they find whoever had actually received the order to swap the materials. Everett recalled a quiet auditor named Franklin Dorsey, a man who had quietly left the industry entirely in the months following the North Valley collapse and had never been heard from since. Silas managed to trace Franklin to a small town nearly 3 hours outside Belmont, living under a different name and keeping almost entirely to himself. By the time they discovered where Franklin was hiding, Barrett had already learned they were closing in, and he ordered Odessa to release a story painting Everett as a man exploiting his connection to Marlowe for a financial windfall. By the following morning, Everett had become the target of a public relations campaign designed to bury him before he could speak another word. Headlines mocked him as the repairman demanding $1 million payout, and footage of his rejection at the Gala entrance was edited and recirculated to make him look like a man deliberately causing a scene for attention. His regular customers began canceling appointments within hours, and a small crowd gathered outside his home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the story everyone suddenly seemed to be discussing. Everett, who relied entirely on that modest income, found himself on the edge of losing the only livelihood he had left. The board of directors demanded that Marlowe distance herself from Everett immediately, and Barrett threatened to call for a vote of no confidence if she continued pursuing the investigation any further. Laurel Gaines warned her privately that personal gratitude, however, genuine, could never substitute for hard legal evidence in the eyes of the board. Reporters camped outside the company headquarters, and analysts speculated on air about whether Marlowe's judgment could still be trusted after what they called an emotional entanglement with a man from her past. Barrett fed the narrative quietly through friendly contacts in the press, careful never to attach his own name to a single leaked detail, letting the story spread on its own until it seemed less like manufactured outrage and more like simple public concern. Marlowe began to waver, not because she doubted Everett's character for even a moment, but because she feared Barrett was steering the entire company toward a crisis she could not contain. Everett made the decision to step away from the investigation, entirely telling Marlowe she had already thanked him more than enough and should not risk her company simply to restore one man's reputation. Marlowe asked him why he always seemed to disappear the moment someone tried to stand beside him. Everett answered that years of raising a daughter alone had taught him to absorb pain quietly, so the people he cared about never had to carry any of it themselves. Marlowe pushed back, telling him that sacrifice was not always noble, and that sometimes it simply allowed the wrong person to keep winning. Her words landed harder than she expected, and something in Everett's resolve shifted. Together with Silas, they finally located Franklin Dorsey, a man living cautiously terrified of losing the modest pension he depended on if he ever spoke up about what he had witnessed years earlier. Franklin admitted, hands trembling, that Barrett had personally instructed him to erase the original certification reports, promising to protect his job in exchange for his silence. He had kept one thing hidden all these years, an audio recording of the meeting, where those instructions were given, terrified that one day the truth would resurface, and he alone would be left holding the blame. In the recording, Barrett's voice was unmistakable, ordering the cheaper materials be used, and stating plainly that if anything ever went wrong, Cole's account would be exactly what investigators found. He explained that he had carried the weight of that silence every single day since leaving the industry, watching from a distance as Everett's name was dragged through headlines for a decision Franklin himself had helped conceal. He said he had convinced himself for years that staying quiet protected his family, but watching an innocent man take the blame a second time was more than his conscience could bear any longer. Franklin agreed to testify. But before the board could even convene to hear his account, Barrett filed an emergency motion demanding Marlowe's removal as chief executive, declaring publicly that he already had the votes secured to take her place. The board assembled for an emergency session, while reporters gathered outside, waiting for confirmation that Marlowe's tenure as chief executive was over. Barrett accused her of endangering shareholder value over what he called a sentimental attachment to a stranger. presenting fabricated reports suggesting Everett was quietly angling for company stock and an executive title of his own. Everett was allowed into the room, but instructed to remain silent until the board completed its vote. Marlowe faced a choice that would define everything that came after. She could abandon Everett publicly and keep her position secure, or she could present the evidence they had gathered and force the company to accept full responsibility for what happened at North Valley regardless of the financial fallout that would surely follow. She chose the truth, without hesitation, announcing that Whitaker Aeronautics would reopen the case, entirely compensate every worker harmed by the collapse, and accept whatever consequences followed. One member warned that the announcement alone could trigger a wave of lawsuits large enough to threaten the company's survival, while another accused Marlowe of letting personal sentiment override her fiduciary duty to every shareholder in the room. Marlowe listened to each objection without flinching, then reminded them that a company built on buried evidence was never as stable as its balance sheet suggested, and that the truth, however costly, was the only foundation strong enough to build on going forward. Several board members erupted in immediate objection. Barrett allowed himself a small, confident smile, certain Marlowe had just ended her own career, in front of everyone who mattered. Then Franklin Dorsey walked into the room beside Silas and confirmed under oath that the recording was authentic in every detail. Barrett insisted the audio could easily have been manipulated, and when Everett produced the steel box of certification slips recovered from the fire, Barrett again denied any connection to the missing signature. That was when Everett revealed a detail no one else had noticed, that every certification slip from North Valley bore the impression of a specific stamping tool with a small distinctive crescent-shaped flaw. That exact tool had once belonged to Barrett's own office, and beneath the scorched ink of one surviving original, the crescent mark was still faintly visible. Silas laid out everything else on the table, the badge access logs, the traffic camera footage, and a full history of unauthorized changes made to internal company accounts, every thread leading directly back to Barrett. Then Marlowe played the final section of the recording, the part Franklin had never shared with anyone, in which Barrett did not merely confess to framing Everett years earlier but also referenced tampering with the Whitaker vehicle if Marlowe ever refused to approve his deal. Barrett was directly implicated in the very crash that had nearly ended Marlowe's life on that mountain road 4 years before. Federal investigators, already alerted and waiting outside, entered the boardroom and instructed Barrett to surrender his phone, his access credentials, and all personal files immediately. As he was escorted from the room, he turned back toward Everett and asked why he had never simply taken the money and disappeared the way most people would have. Everett answered that what Barrett had taken from him was never something money could ever replace. In the weeks that followed, Barrett faced formal charges of fraud, destruction of evidence, reckless endangerment, and corporate data manipulation. The board withdrew every motion to remove Marlowe from her position, and Laurel Gaines admitted openly that Marlowe had made the right decision by placing the truth above the price of company stock. Whitaker Aeronautics established a permanent compensation fund for every worker affected by the North Valley collapse, and Everett's name was formally cleared from every falsified record that had once ruined him. His engineering license, revoked years earlier under false pretenses, was fully reinstated. Marlowe held a press conference on the very steps where Everett had once been turned away, refusing to let that moment be remembered only as a humiliation. Odessa Pike was asked to appear as well, and rather than dismiss her outright, Marlowe gave her the chance to speak honestly in front of the cameras. Odessa admitted without excuses that she had judged Everett entirely on his clothing and his apparent lack of status, and that she had followed instructions from Barrett's team without verifying a single fact for herself. Everett did not demand that Odessa's career be destroyed as punishment. He said only that accountability mattered, but accountability only meant something if it produced real change afterward. Marlowe then delivered a public apology to Everett on behalf of the entire company, telling the crowd gathered before her that they had once allowed a man with power to steal this man's honor and had nearly thrown him out a second time, simply because he did not look important enough to belong. She announced that Everett had not only saved her life once, but had just saved the entire company from walking blindly into another disaster of its own making. Marlowe then offered him a formal position as Director of Safety and Engineering Ethics for Whitaker Aeronautics. Everett did not accept immediately. Instead, he set 3 conditions before he would even consider it. The safety division would need to operate entirely independent of executive control. Every worker on the floor would have the unquestioned right to halt production the moment they identified danger. And no employee at any level could ever face retaliation for reporting a problem honestly. Laurel Gaines, who had spent the entire ordeal weighing loyalty against evidence, told Everett privately that she regretted ever doubting the seriousness of his claims, and that watching him refuse every offer of money or comfort had taught her more about integrity than any boardroom presentation ever had. Everett accepted her words graciously, but reminded her that an apology mattered less than what the company chose to do differently going forward. A sentiment Laurel carried with her into every meeting that followed. The board agreed to every condition without argument. Everett walked back through the doors of the Grand Belmont one more time, though this time there was no red carpet waiting, no orchestra, and no crowd applauding his arrival. There was only Marlowe standing quietly beside him, not as someone rescuing him from anything, but as an equal walking forward into whatever came next. 6 months later, Everett had rebuilt the entire safety infrastructure at Whitaker Aeronautics from the ground up. He turned down the spacious executive office prepared for him, and instead chose a modest room near the production floor, close enough that any worker could walk in and speak with him directly, without an appointment or a secretary standing between them. The anonymous reporting system he designed caught dozens of small mechanical issues long before they had any chance of becoming disasters. Workers who had once been afraid to report a cracked seal or a faulty gauge for fear of losing their jobs now walked directly into Everett's office without hesitation, trusting that his door would never close on them the way so many others had closed on him. He kept a small notebook on his desk, filling it page after page with the kinds of quiet, unglamorous problems that never made headlines but saved lives all the same. A valve replaced before it failed. A warning heeded before it became a tragedy. Company stock dipped sharply in the immediate aftermath of the North Valley revelations, but it steadily recovered as customers across the industry began recognizing Whitaker Aeronautics for having the strictest safety standards in the entire sector. Marlowe herself changed as a leader, no longer content to trust filtered reports handed up from management, choosing instead to walk the production floors regularly and speak with employees face to face. Odessa was reassigned away from crisis communications and placed into an ethics training program, where she was tasked with building a new company initiative aimed at eliminating status-based bias in hiring and public events. Silas received a promotion, taking charge of a newly created division dedicated entirely to protecting employees who came forward with concerns. Franklin Dorsey received legal protection for his testimony and made a public apology to the families of the workers harmed by the collapse he had once helped conceal. The following year, Everett was invited back to the anniversary gala as a guest of honor. Event organizers arranged an expensive tailored suit for the occasion, but he wore his same old gray suit instead, the one with the carefully mended cuff. When someone asked him why, he explained simply that the suit reminded him that clothing had never determined the worth of the person wearing it. Marlowe took the stage that night, but this time she did not retell the story of the burning car on Black Ridge Road. Instead, she spoke about something far more difficult to admit. She told the room that Everett had saved her from becoming the kind of leader who only noticed people once they held an impressive title. Then she handed him the microphone. Everett refused to call himself a hero. He said only that he had been present at the right moment and had simply chosen not to turn away. He closed with a single thought that quieted the entire room, that in places filled with power and prestige, the person most deserving of attention is sometimes the very one standing outside waiting at a locked door. He stepped away from the stage without lingering for the applause that followed, uncomfortable as always, with being the center of attention for too long. Marlowe followed him out to the balcony, where the city lights stretched below them, and asked whether he had ever once regretted saving her on that mountain road 4 winters earlier. Everett told her his only regret was that it had taken 4 years for her to understand that her own life had been worth saving, even on a night when no one else was standing beside her. Marlowe smiled and told him that she finally understood. The two of them stood together in silence, watching the city below their bond, built not on a rushed declaration, but on something steadier, forged from respect, honesty, and the quiet promise of everything still ahead of them. Downstairs, near the entrance of the hotel, a young server in a plain uniform was stopped by a floor manager, who insisted he had no business walking through the section reserved for important guests. Everett noticed the scene from across the lobby and crossed the room without hesitation. He reached the door before the young man could be turned away, pulled it open himself, and held it steady, waiting for him to pass through. The young server thanked him, quietly unsure what to make of the gesture from a man dressed so plainly among the evening gowns and tailored jackets surrounding them, and Everett only nodded the way he always did when he wanted no fuss made over something that felt to him entirely ordinary. He had learned long ago that dignity was rarely announced with fanfare. It was carried quietly in small moments, no one else thought to notice. In the choice to hold a door rather than let it swing shut on someone struggling to reach it. Marlowe watched the exchange from a distance, and something in her chest settled into place, the same feeling she had carried since the night she first called his name across a crowded room. She thought of every executive she had ever known who measured a person's worth by the cut of their suit or the weight of their title, and she understood now more clearly than any quarterly report could teach her that the truest measure of character showed itself only when nothing was being watched. When no cameras waited and no applause was coming, somewhere in the crowd behind them, the orchestra began playing again, and the gala carried on the way. Galas always do, with laughter and champagne and conversations about numbers that would be forgotten by morning. But near the entrance, a floor manager who had nearly turned a young server away found himself standing a little straighter, remembering the quiet correction he had just witnessed from a man in an old gray suit who clearly did not need a title to command respect. Everett Cole never changed the world with grand speeches or bold declarations. He changed it one door at a time, by refusing to ever let it close on someone else the way it had once closed on him.